You thought I was ruthless before, but you haven't seen what I'll do for my family. On Christmas Eve, Mafia King Chris Jordan celebrates his biggest victory until a single photo of his ex holding a newborn shatters his world. Secrets, danger, and a child he never knew existed will force him to confront the past, fight for the present, and protect what matters most. Can he survive the night and save the family he never knew he had? Welcome back to Heart-Woven Tales. I'm Selena, and I hope you're doing well. I'm curious, where are you listening to me from today? Drop it in the comments. Make sure you watch till the very end, don't skip a single moment, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. All right, let's dive in. Chris Jordan's mansion shimmered like a fortress of power, its gold-trimmed lights reflecting against the fresh snow that had quietly fallen through the night. Every balcony, every railing, every column was adorned in meticulous detail, casting a warm glow over the sprawling estate, a glow that should have invited celebration, but instead highlighted the hollowness in the man who ruled over it. Inside, laughter and music roared through the grand hall, a deafening chorus of triumph and revelry. Men drank with the abandon of soldiers who had survived a battlefield. Glasses clinked, bottles uncorked, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive whiskey, polished wood, and the faint tang of cigar smoke. Every smile, every cheer, every pat on the back was meant to honor him. Chris Jordan, the king of the underworld, but he barely noticed. He stood at the far edge of the balcony overlooking the hall, a solitary figure in a black, tailored suit, posture rigid, jaw tight, eyes cold, unblinking like stone carved into human form. His empire was whole, complete, absolute, yet tonight it felt meaningless. The music, meant to be triumphant, grated against his ears. The laughter, meant to fill the hall with warmth, only reminded him of absence. The ghosts of the past, of failures and losses whispered in the corners of the room, relentless and insistent. He could still see her face, Diana Hart, her fire, her laughter, her defiance that had once matched his own. A year had passed since she disappeared, vanished from his life like a phantom, leaving a void he had tried to bury under wealth, violence, and domination. Every breath he took reminded him of her. Every heartbeat seemed synchronized with the memory of her absence. Chris lifted a glass, forcing himself to smile, forcing the act of celebration, but the glass trembled slightly in his grip, betraying the storm beneath his calm exterior. The sound of it brushing against his lips was hollow, empty, as if it carried no meaning at all. He paused mid-sip, feeling a subtle vibration against his suit pocket, sharp and insistent that seemed to slice through the background of celebration. His phone buzzed. Once. Sharp. Piercing. A vibration that cut through the music, through the chatter, through the very air like a blade. Chris's instincts snapped to life, every nerve ending firing as his eyes locked on the screen. And there she was, Diana, pale, exhausted, yet impossibly alive, sitting upright in a hospital bed, clutching a newborn to her chest. The baby, wrapped in a cream-colored blanket embroidered with the Jordan family crest in deep crimson thread, stared at the camera with eyes that mirrored his own storm-blue gaze. Chris felt his stomach lurch, the floor beneath him tilting as if the world had lost its axis. The photograph was impossibly real, impossibly immediate, impossibly devastating. He didn't notice the shattered glass at his feet, the servants frozen mid-step, the whispers dying in their throats. All he could see was her, and the child, and the emblem that bound them to him. Time slowed, music distorted. Every sound around him became distant, inconsequential, a faint echo compared to the pounding of his pulse in his ears. Questions erupted in his mind, wild and frenzied. How? Why? When? How could she be here? How could she be holding a child with his eyes, a child that should not exist without him knowing? The photograph was more than a revelation. It was a challenge, a provocation, a wound carved into his very chest. He tried to speak, to move, to process, but the world around him refused to cooperate. His legs felt heavy, as though bound by invisible chains, and yet the urge to act, to find her, to protect what was his, surged stronger than the inertia that tried to hold him in place. Chris's mind raced through possibilities, everyone more dangerous and horrifying than the last. Someone had put her here. Someone had put his child here. Someone had broken through every layer of his control and carved fear into the edges of his empire. He could almost feel the eyes of unseen threats lurking behind every shadow in the photograph, every corner of the hospital room, every quiet space in the world. He gritted his teeth, jaw cracking with tension. He had ruled the underworld with an iron fist, and yet, in this moment, the empire he built offered him no comfort. His victories tasted sour, his wealth meaningless, his power hollow. He had conquered everything except the past, except the ghost of Diana, except the life she carried in her arms. The room spun slightly as he tried to steady himself, fists tightening into rigid knots at his sides. The baby's tiny fingers curled around the blanket, and Chris felt something he had long thought impossible, a pull, raw and unignorable, tying him irrevocably to a life he hadn't known he was missing. Another vibration jolted him, cutting through the suffocating air of the mansion. This time it was a message, stark and cold, 3 words that made his blood run ice. "She's not safe." The letters glowed on his screen, and in that moment Chris felt the first spark of panic he hadn't allowed himself in years, a panic that threatened to shatter the mask he had worn for decades. The party behind him blurred into insignificance. Men who had celebrated him now seemed like strangers, their laughter distant, hollow echoes that could not touch him. Chris's world had shrunk to a point, a single burning focus. Diana and the child. Every instinct screamed to move, to hunt, to protect, to annihilate anything that threatened what was his. He clenched his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white, the screen reflecting in his storm-blue eyes. And for the first time in years, Chris Jordan felt powerless. Memories of Diana assaulted him in waves, her defiance, her tenderness, her laughter echoing in the corridors of his mind. He saw the last night they were together, the arguments, the tension, the unspoken truths that had built between them, and now all of it culminated in this single image. A newborn in her arms, a life he had not known existed. His pulse raced faster than thought, faster than reason, faster than control. The room seemed to constrict around him, air thick with the scent of his panic. And yet he stood, unmoving, calculating the world he had to conquer next. He allowed himself one breath, long and controlled, a pause to steel every fiber of his body. Victory, power, empire. They were all meaningless if this child, if Diana, were in danger. His vision narrowed, focusing on the photograph again. Every detail burned into his mind. The hospital gown clinging to her shoulders, the faint dark circles under her eyes, the fragile hold she had on the infant, the blanket embroidered with his family's symbol. He saw something else in the photo, something subtle, something deliberate, a shadow in the corner of the frame that hinted at a threat waiting, watching, closing in. Chris stepped back from the balcony, leaving the roaring celebration behind him. Every footstep on the marble echoed like a drumbeat of war. A shard of glass from the broken champagne flute cut his shoe, a silent reminder that danger was everywhere, even in celebration. He felt the first pang of fear in years, cold and sharp, biting at the edges of his iron resolve. His phone buzzed once more, a subtle vibration that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, demanding immediate action. Every instinct in him surged forward. The leader, the predator, the protector, the man who never lost control, now stripped bare by a photograph and 3 words. His empire, his power, his carefully constructed world, nothing mattered. Only one thing did: Diana, the child, and the enemies who would dare threaten them. 2. Chris Jordan didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't allow even a fraction of doubt to slow him. The golden glow of his mansion, the laughter of his men, the echo of his empire's victory, all of it blurred behind him as he tore through the snowy streets, a living storm. His black SUV cut through the winter night with the kind of precision only someone accustomed to violence could command, tires crunching over frost, wipers slicing at the relentless snowfall. Inside the car, his hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were stark white against the leather, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. Rage and fear collided in him, a violent symphony, each note a reminder that the photograph, the baby, Diana, they had shattered the only control he had ever allowed himself to feel. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, to hunt, to annihilate any threat that dared touch what was his. The roads blurred under the headlights, snow streaking like a painting of chaos. Chris barely noticed the cold that bit through his tailored coat, barely noticed the wind whipping against the windows, barely noticed the other drivers scattering in front of him. He was possessed, driven by a force older and more primal than logic, a force that demanded immediate action. The baby's tiny fingers, so impossibly small yet unmistakably his, haunted him with every mile, a living proof of a past he thought lost, forever and a future that could be snatched from him in an instant. Hospital after hospital passed beneath his gaze, each one a potential cage, a potential trap, a potential safe haven where Diana could be hiding. He demanded access with a cold authority that left security and receptionists frozen. Every word, every movement, a reminder that Chris Jordan bent every system to his will. Yet each corridor, each ward, each security checkpoint only amplified his frustration. No Diana, no baby, nothing. The cold machinery of the hospitals seemed to mock him, as if the world itself were conspiring to test the limits of his control. A nurse, flustered and pale, finally slipped, muttering a name, a hint, a direction, just enough for Chris to grasp like a lifeline thrown into a storm-tossed sea. He moved through the hallways with the precision of a predator, senses sharpened to a lethal edge. Every beep of a monitor, every whisper of movement, every faint shuffle of shoes on linoleum became a potential threat or clue. He didn't just walk. He prowled, measuring distances, anticipating every corner, every shadow, every possibility that Diana might have left a trace, however subtle. A discarded glove caught his eye, a tiny thread that someone else would have ignored, and he bent to examine it, heart pounding, knowing instinctively that it was hers. Chris reached the room she'd been in, the number still etched in his memory from the photograph's metadata, and froze just outside the door. The bed was neatly made, IV still dripping but utterly abandoned. The baby's crib, carefully arranged, stood empty. Her bag rested against the chair as though she had left in a hurry, in a panic. The cold bite of absence pressed against his chest, harder than the fiercest winter wind. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and her perfume, a ghostly signature, as if she had been here moments ago and vanished like smoke. He moved inside, every step deliberate, calculating, as though the floor itself could betray him. His eyes scanned the corners, the windows, the door, the closet, the spaces under tables. Nothing. Silence except for the slow drip of the IV, the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent light, the subtle creak of a vent. Chris's chest rose and fell with barely contained fury, mind racing for explanations. Was she in danger? Was someone waiting to strike the moment he found her? Every second of hesitation felt like a razor at his ribs. His fingers brushed against the edge of the pillow, and a folded note caught his attention. Time slowed as he reached for it, the weight of anticipation, dread, and hope pressing down like a vice. He opened it slowly, aware that this could be a trap, a clue, or a message meant to break him. Only 2 words stared back at him, written in a sharp, deliberate hand: "Find us." The words burned like fire across his vision, promising peril, demanding action, and yet confirming everything he already feared. She was out there, and she was not alone. Chris's mind ignited with strategy, every possible angle, every potential threat, every hidden enemy that could be lying in wait. His eyes scanned the room once more, memorizing every detail, every item she could have touched, every surface she could have left a trace on. He traced her steps with his gaze, imagined her movements, felt the ghost of her presence in every shadow. A faint scuff mark near the window suggested she had climbed out in a hurry, the snow outside hiding whatever path she had taken. The urgency of the situation struck him like a physical blow. He was a man who controlled empires, who ruled with fear, who bent entire cities to his will, and yet here, without her, he felt powerless. The thought of her and the baby alone, vulnerable, terrified him more than any gun, any rival, any betrayal he had ever faced. Snow pelted his SUV as he tore away from the hospital, lights reflecting on the frozen streets, wipers slicing through the icy darkness. Each mile increased the pulse in his temples, the tension in his shoulders, the need to find her, to ensure she and the baby were safe. Every shadow, every passing car, every figure moving against the light could be friend or foe, and Chris treated each with lethal suspicion. He barked orders into his phone, his men reacting instantly, tracing hospital records, monitoring exits, scanning routes, anticipating moves. His fury transformed into cold, precise strategy. He didn't just want to find her, he wanted to anticipate every danger, neutralize every threat before it could reach her, make the world kneel before anyone who dared touch what was his. Time became a blur of driving, scanning, analyzing, questioning every instinct. He was moving faster than thought, faster than logic, faster than fear, and yet every instinct screamed that she was closer than he realized. Somewhere in the city, someone was watching him, waiting for the inevitable clash, and he could feel the threads of danger curling around him like vipers. He arrived at another hospital, scanning names and rooms with ruthless efficiency. A single misplaced form, a nurse with nervous hands, a fleeting glance, all became signs pointing toward her, faint but undeniable. Chris moved through corridors with lethal focus, imagining the threats that could strike, visualizing every angle, every hidden attack. The creak of a vent, the hum of a monitor, the shuffle of distant shoes. It could be Diana, it could be an enemy, it could be the first step of a trap waiting to engulf him. He reached her last known room, freezing at the door. The faint perfume, the warmth of the bed, the IV still dripping, all signs she had been there, and yet she was gone. His eyes caught the folded note again on the pillow. Find us. 2 words that carried more weight than an army, more danger than a bullet, more love and terror than he had ever known. Chris's jaw tightened, mind racing. The game had shifted. He was no longer just a predator. He was hunting his heart, and the stakes were higher than ever. 3. Chris moved through the hospital corridors like a storm incarnate, every step measured, every nerve taut, every instinct screaming that he was closing in on her. The sterile lights reflected off the linoleum floor in harsh lines, casting shadows that flickered like phantoms of past violence he had inflicted and endured. He could feel the life in the walls, the faint hum of machines, the sterile scent of disinfectant mingling with the sharp tang of fear lingering in the air. His eyes scanned every corner, every door, every fleeting movement, expecting an ambush, anticipating betrayal, yet longing for a sign of her. The faintest sound, a soft shuffle, a weak cry, a whispered breath, snagged his attention and drove him forward, faster than he intended, heart hammering as though warning him of the danger around the next corner. The back hallway was narrow, lined with cold white tiles and harsh fluorescent lights. Chris's boots struck the floor with deliberate authority, echoing like gunfire in the otherwise empty passage. Each step was a heartbeat, each heartbeat a drumbeat in the war waging inside him between fury, fear, and uncontainable longing. He rounded a corner and froze. There, slumped against the wall, her body shivering slightly, clutching the tiny newborn to her chest, was Diana. Her hair fell in loose strands over her pale face, damp with sweat and tears, and her gown was rumpled from hours of stress and exhaustion. A doctor's voice argued sharply in the distance, the tension in his voice slicing through the hallway, and Chris's gaze immediately snapped to the intrusion, his instincts screaming that they didn't belong, that they were a threat to what he loved. The moment their eyes met, the world seemed to stop. Diana's breath caught in her throat, a sharp intake that revealed the terror she had carried for so long. Chris's cold mask, the armor he wore against the world, shattered instantly. Every muscle in his body tensed, every instinct flared, and he stepped closer, moving with lethal precision and a dangerous softness at once, his gaze locking onto the child as though memorizing the fragile proof of their shared past. The baby stirred slightly, tiny fingers brushing Diana's cheek, and Chris felt an unrelenting pull in his chest, a bond he couldn't deny, a claim made silently across the air. "Is this a joke, Diana?" His voice was low, icy, threaded with fury and disbelief, each word a blade that cut through the tension. The tears streaming down her face, the way she pressed the baby closer, the soft whimpers of the infant, each told him the truth more effectively than any confession ever could. She shook her head, whispering hoarsely, "I never sent the photo. I didn't want you tangled in this, not with him, not with me." And yet her words only fueled the storm raging inside Chris. He wasn't fooled, not for a second. The child's storm-blue eyes, so impossibly like his own, reflected back the undeniable truth. The tiny grasp of her fingers around his thumb, the fragile curve of her lips, the delicate rise and fall of her chest with each breath. Proof that he had never stopped being a part of her life, no matter how far she had run. Every fiber of his being demanded action, but he forced himself to breathe, to process the overwhelming mixture of relief, rage, and love that threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. Chris's eyes darted to the doctor who was still attempting to transfer Diana, a futile gesture against the will of a man who would not allow harm to touch them. His presence alone silenced the argument, the intensity in his gaze enough to halt any further movement. The doctor faltered, realizing that Chris was no ordinary man, that every muscle, every breath, every subtle movement spoke of a predator with lethal intent and unyielding authority. Diana's tears fell freely now, exhaustion and fear mixing in the harsh hospital. Light. Chris reached out, fingers hovering over her shoulder, a gesture of both reassurance and possessiveness, and she flinched, fear etched across her delicate features. His heart thundered as he realized the fragility of the moment. One wrong move, one delayed reaction could tip the balance into tragedy. He allowed himself a single glance at the baby, memorizing the curve of her face, the softness of her hair, the subtle features that mirrored both him and Diana. Every detail was a shard of proof, a talisman against doubt, a reminder that despite the chaos, life persisted. The baby's eyes met his, unafraid, trusting instinctively in a man she had never known, and Chris felt the impossible pull of responsibility tighten around his chest like a vice. The hallway was too quiet suddenly, every sound amplified, the hum of the ventilators, the distant clatter of carts, the faint scuff of shoes in the distance. Chris shifted, scanning, alert for any intrusion. A shadow moved just beyond the door at the far end of the corridor, subtle, deliberate, threatening, and yet he could not tell if it was ally or enemy. Diana whispered again, her voice trembling, fragile as porcelain. "I never wanted you to see this. I wanted to protect you, to keep you away from it." From them. Her words barely hung in the air before a soft, metallic click resonated at the other end of the hallway, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably ominous. Chris's gaze snapped toward the sound, and in that instant, instinct, training, and emotion collided. He moved faster than thought, closing the distance between himself, Diana, and the baby, his presence a shield, his shadow a warning. Before he could speak another word, the door at the far end rattled violently, as though someone was attempting to force it open, and his body stiffened, every nerve alert, every muscle primed to strike. The baby stirred, sensing the tension, her tiny whimpers slicing through the silence. Diana's hand tightened around her torso, and Chris stepped closer, voice low, lethal, yet threaded with the unspoken promise of protection. "I told you, no one will touch what's mine." Outside the door, muffled sounds suggested movement, effort, intrusion. Someone, somewhere, was coming for them, and the hallway suddenly became a battleground suspended in time. Chris's mind raced as he anticipated every possible threat, visualizing angles, exits, weapons, advantages. Even in the moment, he knew he could not hesitate, not for a second, not for a heartbeat, not while the lives of Diana and the child hung in the balance. The tension in the corridor thickened with each breath. Every shadow seemed to pulse with menace, every fluorescent flicker a signal of impending danger, every sound amplified into a potential threat. Chris instinctively shifted to shield Diana and the child, moving to block any line of attack while scanning for escape routes, weak points, and possible traps. He felt the pull of adrenaline, sharper, more precise than any he had felt in years, the hunter instinct within him fully awakened, a storm of fury, love, and unyielding protection. Diana's tears blurred her vision, but she clung to the baby as if her entire world depended on that fragile grip. Chris reached out, placing his hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of both reassurance and dominance, signaling that he would not allow anyone to take what was his. The door rattled again, harder this time, as though someone had realized he was there, and the hallway became a crucible of tension, danger, and unspoken emotion. The baby's tiny fingers clutched at Diana's gown, and Chris saw the reflection of his own storm blue eyes mirrored in hers, a silent, undeniable connection that no one could sever. The intruder's presence outside the door became more pronounced, a deliberate attempt, a signal, a threat, and Chris's instincts flared into action. Chris moved a fraction closer, positioning himself to block the doorway completely if it was forced, his shadow stretching over Diana and the child. Every second felt stretched into eternity, every heartbeat a drumbeat of tension, every breath a countdown toward a confrontation he did not yet see fully. Diana whispered again, words lost in the tremor of her voice, yet heavy with meaning and fear. Chris's eyes never left the doorway, anticipating the moment the barrier would fail and the world would erupt into chaos around them. The rattling at the door subsided, a tense silence settling over the hallway like a suffocating blanket. Chris Jordan kept his body rigid, eyes sharp, muscles coiled like springs ready to explode, every sense trained on the world beyond the threshold. He could feel the vibrations of footsteps retreating, the faint shift of air indicating that whoever had tried to force their way in had temporarily backed off, reassessing their approach. The relief was fleeting, fragile, because he knew that in this game, danger never truly disappeared. The faintest creak of the floorboards behind him made him flinch, heart hammering, mind calculating, as he shifted instinctively to shield Diana and the child, his hand brushing over her trembling shoulder with lethal tenderness. Diana's body sagged slightly against the wall, exhaustion etched into every line of her frame. Her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond, as though she had been carrying a truth too heavy for one lifetime, too dangerous for him to know until now. Chris's storm blue eyes never left hers, scanning every twitch, every flutter of her fingers, every flicker of movement from the tiny baby cradled in her arms. He could feel the tension radiating from her as clearly as if it were his own pulse, the weight of years apart, of secrets kept, of dangers endured, pressed down on him with unbearable force. Finally, her lips parted, voice trembling and fragile, yet carrying the weight of unspoken terror. "I ran," she whispered, "because I was pregnant, because enemies from my past resurfaced, because I knew your world would destroy her before she even breathed." The words struck him like a hammer to the chest, echoing in the sterile hallway, each syllable a revelation that cut deeper than any blade he had ever faced. Chris's jaw tightened, eyes locked on the baby as he absorbed the truth. Tiny Ava, so small, so perfect, curled her fingers around his thumb instinctively, as if claiming him, anchoring him to a bond that had never been broken despite distance, silence, and fear. The world seemed to narrow into the three of them, Chris, Diana, and Ava, while shadows of danger lingered just beyond the walls, waiting for the slightest misstep. He dropped his voice to a rasp, every word a promise forged from fire and obsession. "You should have known. I would burn down the world before letting anyone touch my family." The words reverberated down the corridor, both warning and vow, and Chris's presence pressed over them like a shield, impenetrable and absolute. Diana's tears fell freely now, mingling exhaustion, relief, and fear, each drop a silent acknowledgement of the danger she had endured alone. Chris took a step closer, his fingers brushing against Ava's tiny hand, marveling at the fragile grip and the unspoken trust she already placed in him. Every instinct screamed that this bond was sacred, that any interference would ignite fury beyond measure, and yet the quiet moment was already trembling on the edge of disaster. Her voice broke again, whispering more truths, trembling on the edge of confession. She spoke of threats, of shadows that had haunted her since she discovered she carried his child, of faceless enemies who would stop at nothing to erase them both. The faint scrape of something sliding along the window pane made Chris spin, muscles taut, mind racing for the threat he knew would arrive before they could even breathe. A sudden explosive crack shattered the fragile calm, the sound of gunfire tearing through the hospital corridor. The bullets smashed into the wall beside them, plaster dust falling like snow, a deafening reminder that danger was closer than they had imagined. Chris reacted instantly, a blur of controlled fury, moving to press himself between Diana and the child. The world narrowed to his focus, to the fragile warmth he had vowed to protect, and he felt the violent surge of adrenaline as his mind calculated every angle of attack, every possible threat. Diana pressed herself closer, fear and relief mingling in her trembling body as Chris's presence enveloped them like a shield forged from rage. The shattered glass on the floor glimmered like lethal confetti under the harsh lights, a constant reminder that time was slipping and danger was still imminent. Chris's gaze flicked to the broken window, assessing the trajectory, the position, the possibilities of more attackers. Every instinct screamed that this was not random, that the enemy had planned their moment, and that Chris had mere seconds to respond. He felt Ava stir against his chest, her tiny fingers brushing against his shirt, a reminder of the fragile life he would kill to protect. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hospital corridors, faint but deliberate, signaling that reinforcements or additional threats were closing in. Chris shifted his stance, shoulders squared, eyes scanning every shadow, every reflection, every possible entry point. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, every door a potential danger, every sound amplified into threat, every flicker of light a warning. Diana's tears continued to fall, her exhaustion palpable, but Chris's presence grounded her, even as the fear of another gunshot made her flinch. The shiver of tension that ran down her spine mirrored his own anticipation, the knowledge that the next moment could decide everything. Chris whispered, voice low and dangerous, a lethal promise. "Stay behind me. I won't let anyone touch you or her." The tiny grip of Ava's fingers tightened, sensing the unspoken oath in his tone, trusting a man she had never known but whose essence radiated authority, protection, and power. The shattered glass rattled slightly as cold wind seeped in, carrying the faint scent of snow, of the night outside, and the hidden menace lurking in it. Every heartbeat was amplified, each second stretched, the calm before the inevitable next strike building unbearable tension. Chris's mind raced, every detail of his surroundings logged with military precision, the angle of the broken window, the location of the doors, the reflective surfaces that could reveal an enemy, the minimal cover, and the potential escape routes. He knew that the attacker would not wait for him to make a move. The initiative was theirs, and every second of hesitation could cost them everything. Diana clutched Ava tighter, shivering with exhaustion and terror, and Chris felt a surge of protective fury so intense that it felt like fire coursing through his veins. His chest rose and fell rapidly, every muscle coiled like a spring, every sense acute, every thought focused solely on survival. The faint creak of the hallway outside shifted his attention, and he moved to press the baby closer to his chest, shielding her with his body while scanning the corridor for movement. Shadows shifted, hints of movement at the edge of his vision, suggesting that the danger had not retreated. It was calculating, stalking, waiting for a moment to strike. Chris's teeth clenched, eyes narrowing, mind running at impossible speed, plotting every possible confrontation, anticipating each action of whoever dared threaten them. The sound of glass crunching outside made him stiffen, ready to unleash lethal force in an instant, the father and protector in him fully awakened. Diana whispered again, this time barely audible. I didn't know who else to trust. I thought if I kept them safe, you wouldn't be dragged into it." Her confession was interrupted by another faint but deliberate sound, the distant metallic click of a weapon being readied, sending Chris into immediate defensive posture. Chris's hand brushed Ava's hair back gently, feeling the delicate warmth and life in her tiny body, reinforcing the promise he had whispered moments ago, nothing would harm them. The sound of a slow, deliberate step outside suggested the enemy was testing their patience, calculating their next move, preparing for confrontation. The hallway, once a sterile corridor of hospital neutrality, had become a battlefield in Chris's mind, every reflection a possible threat, every shadow a potential adversary. He could feel the tension coiling around him, a tangible presence, and the silence before the next strike was suffocating. The hallway erupted in chaos without warning. Bullets shredded the air, ripping through plaster and glass, sparks of debris flying as the masked men stormed in with calculated brutality. Chris reacted without hesitation, every movement precise, every muscle coiled, his predator instincts merging with the sudden, raw force of a father's fury. One masked figure lunged from the shadows, but Chris's fist connected with a crack that echoed through the corridor, dropping the man instantly, a warning to the rest that nothing would come near Diana or Ava without consequence. Diana pressed herself closer to him, instinctively wrapping her arms around Ava, trying to shield her from the bullets and the shattering chaos. Her body trembled violently, every inch of her expressing fear, exhaustion, and a desperate hope that Chris would somehow protect them. A second attacker swung a crowbar toward her, the metallic hiss slicing the air, and Chris moved like lightning, intercepting the blow with a hand that could crush bone effortlessly. Every step Chris took was a calculated storm, every movement a deadly ballet. He dodged bullets with an unnatural precision, his vision narrowing to the movements of his enemies and the fragile lives he had sworn to protect. A spray of shrapnel tore across the wall behind him, close enough to singe the edges of his coat, and Chris's teeth clenched, adrenaline fusing with raw, unrelenting rage. He barked orders into his earpiece, his men mobilizing immediately, but in this corridor it was only him, Diana, and Ava, against the relentless tide of attackers. The wail of alarms and the echo of shattering glass created a dissonant symphony, punctuating each heartbeat as if the world itself had slowed to watch his every move. Chris's eyes flicked from enemy to enemy, reading their movements, predicting their intentions before their hands even reached for weapons. He moved Diana toward the emergency exit, her grip on Ava tightening instinctively, his presence a shield of lethal force around them. A masked man lunged from behind a corner, blade swinging, and Chris pivoted with predatory grace, the weapon flying from the attacker's hand with a precision that could have been rehearsed in a nightmare. Snow hit the hospital windows, cold and sharp, as if nature itself was warning the intruders. Chris's boots skidded slightly on the slick floor, but he adjusted instantly, dragging Diana and the baby closer, calculating every inch of their path with lethal foresight. Another gunshot rang out, this one striking a wall just inches from Ava's head, sending shards of plaster into the air, and Chris's pulse surged in violent rhythm. He moved like a shadow across the corridor, a figure of unrelenting menace. Every strike a symphony of controlled fury. One attacker tried to flank him, moving from the opposite end, and Chris pivoted effortlessly, fists and knees moving in a deadly dance that left the assailant crumpled on the floor. Diana clutched Ava closer, feeling the heat of Chris's body behind her, the strength and control that radiated from him, a protective wall against chaos. A piece of debris fell near them, and the infant whimpered softly, stirring Chris into an almost animalistic protective frenzy. The corridor seemed to stretch into infinity, every sound amplified, the hiss of bullets, the crash of doors, the panicked shouts of enemies, the faint groans of those already incapacitated. Chris's eyes scanned the ceiling and corners, anticipating threats before they appeared, knowing that in the next heartbeat, another masked figure could emerge from anywhere. Chris reached the stairwell, dragging Diana and Ava down the slick, narrow steps with controlled urgency. A gunshot ricocheted off the railing, grazing the wall near his head, and the sound was deafening in the enclosed space, making the hairs on his neck stand on end. Snow slammed against the hospital windows, cold gusts creeping into the hallway, and Chris felt the bite of winter against his skin, even through the heavy coat. The attackers seemed almost supernaturally coordinated, as though they anticipated his every move, testing him, prodding for a weakness, but Chris had none to give. He reached the lobby, dragging Diana toward the SUV waiting outside, tires spinning on the icy snow, engine roaring like a beast anticipating the hunt. Another masked figure blocked their path momentarily, weapon raised, but Chris reacted instantly, driving the man back with a shoulder that could have shattered bone. Snow and wind whipped around them as Chris shoved Diana into the SUV, cradling Ava tightly against his chest. The faintest brush of her hair against his coat reminded him of every second lost, every moment she had been in danger, every threat that had dared to come near what was his. "They want you?" His voice was low, dangerous, filled with uncontainable rage, eyes blazing with a storm that mirrored the fury he felt inside. "Fine, they can try, but they won't survive touching what's mine." The words carried a lethal promise, vibrating with power and warning, and for a split second, even the masked figures outside seemed to hesitate. Chris wiped a smear of blood from Diana's forehead, the warmth of her skin searing against his gloved hand. Her eyes fluttered weakly, exhaustion overtaking her in a dangerous way, and he felt a cold panic claw at his chest. The SUV lurched forward, tires biting into snow and ice as he maneuvered with precision, snowflakes stinging their faces, wind tearing at the edges of their clothes. Every turn, every obstacle, every shadow outside the windows, became a potential threat, and Chris's vigilance sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. He shifted slightly to shield Diana as another masked figure attempted to climb toward the vehicle from the ground, throwing them off balance. Chris's fist connected with the man's jaw with a crack that echoed over the storm, sending him sprawling into the snow, unconscious. But the threat lingered. Diana's breathing was shallow, her eyelids heavy, her body trembling against his chest. Chris could feel her faint pulse against his ribcage, each beat a fragile reminder that every second mattered, that any lapse could be fatal. The sirens of distant police vehicles were muted, irrelevant, powerless against the storm Chris had become. The attackers were relentless, but Chris's determination, fueled by fury and the unbreakable bond to his child and Diana, transformed him into a whirlwind of lethal action. The car screeched to a halt outside, snow piling against the tires, engine growling, and Chris dragged Diana inside, her body slumping against him. The infant stirred, tiny fingers brushing against his collar, a silent, unspoken bond that tightened his resolve to the edge of obsession. His eyes scanned every direction, every shadow, every potential hiding spot, while his hands remained firm around Diana and Ava. The wind whipped around them, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the distant gunfire, a subtle warning that the night was far from over. Diana's eyes fluttered weakly, and Chris's heart sank as exhaustion finally claimed her. She collapsed unconscious across his arms, body yielding completely to fatigue and fear. And in that moment, Chris realized that the responsibility he bore was heavier than any empire he had ever ruled. The roar of the SUV's engine faded behind them as Chris slammed the doors of his private clinic open, the sterile lights inside reflecting off the blood still smeared faintly on his coat. Every step was weighted, purposeful, yet a trembling urgency ran through him, an urgency born not of his empire, not of wealth or control, but of the fragile life in his arms. Ava's tiny cries pierced the air, sharp and insistent, and Chris's chest tightened, each wail stabbing through the armor he had spent years forging. The sound of her voice, so impossibly small, so impossibly his, sent a cold fire through his veins, warning him that failure was unacceptable, that no one could ever touch her without facing his wrath. He strode through the clinic's corridor, boots striking the floor with authority that made staff pause mid-step, glances following him with a mixture of fear and awe. Every shadow in the hallway seemed alive, every flicker of light a potential danger, every passing face a reminder that his world had narrowed into one critical objective: the safety of Diana and Ava. Doctors and nurses moved with rapid precision, shuffling equipment, opening doors, murmuring instructions, but Chris barely acknowledged them. His gaze locked on Ava, the tiny life cradled against his chest, so fragile, so unbreakably precious. Her little hands pressed against his coat, tiny fingers clutching instinctively, and Chris felt a bond unlike any he had ever experienced, a tether so strong it made his chest ache. He entered the examination room where Diana was being tended, pale and shivering from shock and blood loss, monitors beeping around her as machines tracked her vitals. Each beep sounded like a countdown to catastrophe, a reminder that every second mattered and that any misstep could cost everything he valued in the world. Chris's hands were steady despite the storm inside him, gently adjusting the blanket around Ava, whispering softly as if the words could convey his promise to her, even though she could not understand. Her eyes, so impossibly like his own, blinked up at him with trust, a silent acknowledgement that he existed not just as her father, but as her protector, her world, and her only safe harbor. He paced the hallway outside the operating room, boots scuffing against the polished floor, a shadowed storm of contained fury and unrestrained worry. Every tick of the clock, every muffled shout of the medical staff, Every soft cry from Ava echoed in his mind, reminding him of every second he had failed to protect her, and every second yet to come that he could not afford to fail. Chris's jaw clenched, fists flexing at his sides as he replayed the events leading up to this moment. The gunshots, the shattered glass, the way Diana had collapsed in his arms, and he felt the weight of his own fear, the fear he had never allowed himself to feel before. A sudden squeak from the hallway made him spin, every muscle tensing instantly, eyes scanning for threat even though the danger had receded, or so it seemed. The surgeon finally emerged, scrubs dusted with sweat and blood from earlier emergencies, and Chris's heart lurched as he saw the relief in the man's eyes. "She'll survive," the surgeon said, voice calm but weighted with meaning, and Chris felt as though he might collapse from the overwhelming surge of relief and exhaustion. He entered the quiet recovery room, with Ava cradled carefully in his arms, every movement precise, every step measured as if the slightest jostle could shatter the fragile trust the child had already placed in him. The soft hum of monitors and the faint beeping of the machines became a lullaby, a tenuous thread connecting past chaos to present sanctuary. Diana lay pale on the bed, chest rising and falling weakly, hair damp with sweat, face flushed from trauma, yet etched with an exhaustion that spoke of unimaginable struggle. Chris approached silently, feeling the enormity of the moment settle around him, the fragility of life, the weight of responsibility, the infinite delicacy of trust in a newborn's gaze. He sat beside her, cradling Ava against his chest like a shield, like a promise, like a world contained in his arms. The child's breathing was even, her tiny chest pressing against him, yet Chris felt the tremor of vulnerability that came from holding a life so small, so precious, and so utterly reliant on him. Diana's eyelids fluttered as she began to regain consciousness, a faint, fragile awareness returning to her eyes. The first thing she saw was Chris holding their daughter, and in that instant the storm of her fear, relief, and love collided into a silent, overwhelming wave. Chris's gaze never wavered from the child's face, memorizing every curve, every feature, every subtle line inherited from both him and Diana. He felt the unspoken trust, the instinctual bond, the fragile connection that tethered his heart completely to Ava, and through her, to Diana. The soft, rhythmic rise and fall of Ava's chest against his own became a pulse in his chest, a measure of the new life he had vowed to protect at any cost. Every breath, every movement, every tiny flutter of her eyelids reinforced his resolve, sharpened his focus, and ignited a primal protective instinct he had never known he possessed. Chris whispered softly, words meant only for the tiny life in his arms. "I've got you. No one will ever hurt you. Not now. Not ever." The quiet strength in his tone seemed to soothe the child, her small hands pressing instinctively against his coat, as though understanding the promise in his voice. Diana's gaze met his, voice faint, trembling, yet full of recognition. You kept her safe," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of every second she had feared they would lose her, and every second she had survived alone before he arrived. Chris's hand brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering just long enough to convey a silent, unbreakable vow. The tension that had built over nights of fear, days of danger, and moments of near loss began to ease, though every nerve in his body remained alert, anticipating threats even in the calm. Ava stirred slightly, tiny lips parting in a yawn, and Chris shifted to adjust her position, careful not to wake her fully, but allowing her to press closer, seeking warmth and reassurance. Each small movement reminded him of the fragility of life, the absolute importance of his presence, and the stakes he could never afford to ignore. The sterile quiet of the clinic contrasted with the chaos of the previous night, yet Chris's mind remained a battlefield of vigilance, awareness, an instinct. Every shadow, every sound, every distant noise carried potential danger, and he remained poised to act at the slightest sign of threat. Diana's hand reached instinctively toward the child, but Chris held Ava for just a heartbeat longer, pressing a soft kiss to the baby's forehead. The gesture, gentle yet possessive, shattered the remnants of their fear while reinforcing the bond that neither could deny. He finally placed Ava in Diana's arms, cupping her face and feeling the fragile weight of both mother and child in his grasp. The three of them existed in a moment outside time, suspended between terror, relief, and love, the culmination of every choice, every danger, every battle that had led them here. Chris remained close, vigilant, protective, as if the world itself could shift and take them away in the blink of an eye. The quiet hum of the monitors, the soft rustle of blankets, and the faint echo of footsteps outside reminded him that this moment of peace could shatter at any second. Diana's eyes slowly opened fully, taking in the scene, the child, and the man who had become more than the ruthless Mafia boss she had feared and hated in the past. The realization that Chris held their daughter like she was his entire world hit her with an overwhelming mix of relief, love, and awe, and the room seemed suspended in fragile perfection. Chris whispered again, voice low, deadly in its tenderness, "I will never let anything hurt either of you, ever." The promise was not just words. It radiated through him, sealing a bond that danger, distance, or enemies could never sever. 7. The soft hum of the monitors in the clinic was almost hypnotic, a gentle rhythm against the chaos of the last 24 hours, yet Chris's mind refused to calm. Ava lay sleeping in his arms, tiny chest rising and falling, the perfect, delicate embodiment of trust and innocence. Each breath she took was a reminder of the world he had once ruled with fear and dominance, now eclipsed by the fragility and brilliance of what truly mattered. Diana's eyes, still wide from shock and relief, never left him, as though seeing him cradle their child in that tender, possessive way revealed more about him than she had ever imagined possible. Her voice trembled, soft, almost fragile. "You're holding her." And Chris met her gaze with a gentleness so foreign that it seemed to redefine him entirely. His usual storm-blue eyes, weapons in themselves when pointed at the world, now softened into pools of something she had only glimpsed before in fleeting moments of vulnerability, and even that had been restrained. He spoke slowly, deliberately, the weight of his words wrapping around them like steel and silk simultaneously. "She's mine. You're mine. And I'm done living a life where either of you are missing." Each word was a vow, a declaration, a fortress built around their shared existence, and Diana felt the unyielding strength behind it, tempered by love so intense it was almost unbearable. Diana instinctively reached for Ava, but Chris, as if unwilling to relinquish. Even a heartbeat of possession held the baby closer, pressing a tender kiss to her tiny forehead. The action, delicate yet laden with power, shattered every protective wall Diana had built over the years, leaving her raw and unguarded in the presence of the man who had once terrified and captivated her in equal measure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity in suspended time, Chris gently placed their daughter into Diana's arms, cupping her face with a possessiveness that radiated not cold authority, but fiery protection. His gaze locked onto hers, and the room seemed to tilt slightly in the gravity of the unspoken understanding. No one could touch them, and nothing could break the bond forged in blood, fire, and love. Diana's lips trembled, a soft intake of breath escaping her as she pressed closer to Ava, feeling the warmth and fragility of their daughter against her chest. She had feared loss for so long, feared separation, feared a life where Chris's world might forever endanger the fragile lives she carried in both body and heart. Chris leaned slightly, whispering low and deadly in a voice meant only for her. "No more running. I protect my family. Always." Each syllable resonated with absolute conviction, a promise forged in the fires of 1,000 battles, both literal and emotional, and Diana felt it seep into her bones, anchoring her to him in a way that could never be undone. Outside, snow drifted lazily past the windows, soft and unrelenting, covering the world in white calm, and Christmas lights flickered gently, casting warm reflections against the walls. For the first time, Chris Jordan seemed not like the cold, ruthless king of an empire, but like a man reborn into something richer, something tangible, something worth more than power or fear. Diana studied him closely, noticing the subtle softness around his eyes, the tension released in his shoulders, the quiet pride that emanated from every line of his body as he watched their child sleep. Each detail whispered a story she hadn't dared to hope was possible, a narrative of transformation fueled by love, fear, and the undeniable weight of responsibility. Chris finally allowed himself to breathe, exhaling slowly, the storm of the past night fading only slightly as he shifted to sit closer, ensuring both mother and daughter were fully enveloped in his protection. Yet even in this moment of serenity, a primal vigilance remained in his gaze, as if he knew the world would not rest and danger could surface when least expected. Diana nestled Ava more securely, tilting her head to press against Chris's shoulder. The warmth of his body, the subtle steadying of his hand, the careful attention to every small detail of their daughter's comfort made her heart ache with recognition and wonder. Chris's voice softened further, almost a murmur as he looked at Diana. "I've lived for power, for control, for empire. But none of it mattered until now. You and Ava, you are my world." The quiet honesty in his tone was disarming, an emotional declaration that carried the force of everything he had ever been and ever would be, and Diana felt it seep into the deepest parts of her soul. Ava stirred slightly in Diana's arms, tiny fingers brushing against Chris's hand as if acknowledging him, claiming him as her protector. That single innocent gesture caused an almost unbearable swell of emotion in Chris, a mixture of love, fear, and awe he had never allowed himself to feel before. The room was bathed in soft golden light from the flickering Christmas bulbs, shadows dancing gently across the walls, and Chris remained still, holding his family in a careful, reverent grip. Each movement, each breath, each subtle shift reminded him of the fragility of the moment, the preciousness of the lives entrusted to him, and the absolute necessity of unwavering vigilance. Diana finally dared to speak, voice trembling. You're really different now. I can see it. You're not just Chris Jordan. You're someone else. Someone who cares beyond everything else." Chris's lips curved faintly, a ghost of a smile, the first in what felt like decades that wasn't marred by calculation, cruelty, or cold ambition. He leaned closer to press his forehead briefly against hers, eyes closing momentarily as he whispered, "I care more than you'll ever know. Nothing, and no one, will ever change that." The quiet intensity of his tone wrapped around them like armor, solid and impenetrable, yet tender enough to let them feel the warmth of his heart. The soft rustle of papers at the door drew Chris's attention. A nurse appeared, holding an envelope with careful hands, the routine gesture suddenly heavy with intrigue and subtle tension. Chris took the envelope cautiously, his instincts alert even in this sanctuary of peace. Every movement was measured, every microsecond anticipating danger, because in his life, calm was always temporary. He opened it slowly, fingers brushing over the contents, and his eyes narrowed as he took in what was inside, a newborn ID bracelet, identical to Ava's. A chill ran through him, a flash of instinctual alarm as he read the attached note, "There's more you don't know." Diana's eyes widened, a shiver running down her spine. She clutched Ava closer, feeling the weight of uncertainty intrude into the fragile peace, sensing that the night's trials were not yet fully over. Chris's jaw clenched, eyes scanning the room, every nerve firing. The promise of protection, of family, was suddenly tempered by a looming unknown, a hint that their world still held secrets, threats, and mysteries that demanded vigilance. Yet even in the face of potential danger, Chris remained calm, poised, protective. Every instinct screamed to act, to search, to eliminate the threat. Yet he allowed himself a moment to absorb the gravity of the discovery, the possibility that Ava was not alone in her significance, that their story had deeper layers than he had imagined. Diana's fingers brushed over the bracelet, her lips trembling slightly, and Chris held her hand in his, covering it with his own. The contact was grounding, reassuring, yet it also served as a silent acknowledgement that their journey was far from over. Snow continued to drift softly outside, the world serene, deceptively calm, as if mocking the turbulence that had carried them here. Chris's eyes lingered on the falling flakes, each one a reminder of the fragile, fleeting nature of peace and the vigilance required to protect what truly mattered. He finally lifted his gaze to Diana, voice low but resolute. "We face it together. Whatever it is, we face it as a family." The weight of his words, paired with the unyielding protectiveness in his tone, cemented the moment as a turning point, not just in the night, but in his life, their lives, and the bond that held them together. Chris positioned himself slightly behind Diana, still holding her hand and glancing at Ava sleeping in her arms. The protective triangle he formed around them symbolized more than safety. It symbolized the man he had become, no longer just a ruthless boss, but a father, a protector, and a partner in unbreakable unity. Diana finally exhaled slowly, letting a fraction of the tension leave her body, yet her eyes remained alert, scanning Chris's expression, seeking reassurance, understanding, and strength. Chris's gaze returned unwavering, storm-blue eyes softened only by love and determination, reflecting the promise that nothing would ever harm them again. He held both mother and daughter in his view, voice soft, almost reverent. "You are my world, and I will never let it fall apart again." The phrase hung in the air, powerful, protective, and filled with an intensity that rendered every previous night of fear, rage, and loss irrelevant, eclipsed by the certainty of his resolve. The nurse hesitated at the door, sensing the weight of the moment before quietly leaving, allowing the family their fragile peace. Yet Chris remained alert, a shadowed guardian even in moments of calm, every muscle coiled, every sense tuned, knowing that the world beyond the walls still held unknown threats. The soft snow, the flickering lights, the warmth of their bodies pressed together, all became symbols of hope, of life reclaimed, of a family forged in fire, danger, and unyielding love. Chris knew that the letter hinted at future challenges, but for now, they had survived. They had each other, and the night, though far from simple, was theirs to claim. Wow, what an emotional journey. Thank you so much for listening till the very end. I hope Chris, Diana, and Ava's story stayed with you as much as it did with me. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves emotional stories, and subscribe to Heartwoven Tales so you never miss a tale that touches the heart. Comment below your favorite moment from the story. I'd love to hear where it hit you the most. Until next time, stay tuned, stay inspired, and keep your heart woven with stories.